This is Stand Up for the Truth, addressing important issues and topics affecting Christians across the nation.
Good morning. It's a fresh new podcast today, and depending on the topic, if we behave, we'll be on YouTube, or if not, on our Rumble video channel later on today.
That's right.
After lunch. We're live now and in Northeast Wisconsin online at q90fm.com/app. Fresh new podcast today, November 13, 2025. Mary Danielson.
Yes, good morning. It is November 13th. It's Thursday. Creationist Christopher Rupe is my guest from Back to number 2 Genesis. Looking forward to this conversation this morning. But first, I have a scripture, Job 36, 24-33. Remember to magnify his work, of which men have sung. Everyone has seen it. Man looks on it from afar. Behold, God is great, and we do not know him, nor can the number of his years be discovered. For he draws up drops of water, which distill as rain from the mist, which the clouds drop down and pour abundantly on man. Indeed, can anyone understand the spreading of clouds, the thunder from his canopy? Look, he scatters his light upon it and covers the depths of the sea. For by these he judges the peoples. He gives food in abundance. He covers his hands with lightning and commands it to strike. His thunder declares it, the cattle also concerning the rising storm. What a great passage. Let's pray together this morning. Oh Lord, you are the rock that is higher than I. Your name is holy. Your name is above every name in heaven and in earth. We're in awe of your majesty and, Lord, how you extend such grace and mercy to your creation throughout all generations. Oh, Lord, give us a never-ending sense of wonder and draw us closer to you as you get us ready for eternity. We lift up Chris to you today, Lord. Thank you for his gifts and all the ways that you have equipped him to build up the church with truth. Bless him and his loved ones. Open doors for ministry. Protect and guide them. Give them the grace to finish well, Lord, and to finish with joy. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Chris Rupe is a sedimentary geologist and biologist who has been speaking on the topic of origins for many years. He's the founder of Back to Genesis and co-author of Contested Bones. He has presented to many different venues, radio, TV, universities, middle and high school level, conferences, churches. In addition to his research in the area of human population genetics, he has spent several years studying the so-called hominid fossils, also known as ape men. He's published numerous articles on topics ranging from pseudogenes and bacterial evolution to the origin of life and the fossil record, and we are going to settle all that today. Welcome to Stand Up for the Truth, Chris.
Thank you so much for having me on. Pleasure to be here. Very humbled and grateful for this time.
Well, I'm just looking forward to chatting with you. What a great subject. Tell us a little bit about yourself, because you're new to the audience. Did you grow up in a Christian home, or did you find yourself sort of knocking on various spiritual doors when you got a little bit older?
Yeah. So mostly I was born in a Christian home, and then things were, great growing up. I had biblically consistent parents. There was no hypocrisy. They were just loving, great parents that taught me biblical values. Went to church growing up. But when I was in high school, I began to question things. And, that time in my life, people were obviously not following the Lord. I was in a public school. And if you're a Christian, you're born again, you would stand out as a sore thumb because, everybody's drinking pretty much, even in high school, drinking, partying, all kinds of things. And I understood what the Bible says. It says you can't do those things, and you have to walk the straight and narrow and walk in obedience and holiness. And so for me, it was, well, why would I do that? Why would I, why is it worth it to do that if this isn't even true? And so I began to question, well, what if the Bible is not really the word of God? How can I know that's true? And did Jesus really rise from the dead? And one question I had in my head was, what if I'm just an evolved ape and there's really no God? And if I'm an evolved ape, essentially, then right and wrong is, well, it's more or less your opinion. And if you can get away with it, why not? So it made a big difference in my life at that point to figure this out. And a miracle happened. I got rid of my PlayStation and Xbox and just devoted myself to studying and seeking whether or not I could even discover the truth, whether it was evolution, creation, the Bible, God of the Bible, or some other God. And the information I found was from Other Creation Ministries. And it really opened my eyes to realizing, wow, my faith is not disconnected from the world I live in. It's not disconnected from rock layers, fossils, and these earthly things.
Right.
And my faith is really rooted in the history of the Bible, because the history is not myth. It's not disproven by modern science. And so that led me on a journey to want to pursue the sciences.
Wow.
And so I went to a state university in New York called SUNY Geneseo. And there I got my degree in biology. And after that, I did 7 years doing research with former atheist from Cornell, Dr. John Sanford. We did a lot of genetics research and human origins research. That's when I was able to co-author a book, Contested Bones, behind me there with him. And that's all on the so-called ape-like creatures, the so-called missing links. And then finally, I spent another 7 years getting my PhD in geology. So a long journey and a lot of research. And it's only strengthened my faith over the years to realize, wow, those things I learned from Other Creation Ministries, when you really dive deeper into them, they still bear out. The big picture is there. There's Adam and Eve are real people. We didn't evolve from apes. There really was a literal fall that explains why we have mutations. And there is a global flood, and the evidence from the fossils and rock layers supports that. And it just activated my faith. I said, I'm going to give my life to this cause. I got baptized when I was younger, soon after those doubts were settled. And I've been doing this now for 20 years.
Wow. What a great story. And you kind of hit the nail on the head with something that is very foundational to what we believe as Christians. Because if that, I'm going to go through the history of that chart of the chimpanzee to human, but if that's true, there's no sin issue. How convenient is that, Chris? Because that chimpanzee didn't sin. That ape didn't sin, but look, that human did. And so it builds on a very faulty and shaky foundation that there's no sin. There's no need for a savior. Talk about knocking down every single brick that you and I believe. How convenient is that? Do you have any thoughts on that? Because that is so foundational, the sin issue, and why we need a redeemer.
Yeah, and that's a major issue. And that's why I like to talk to Christians about this, because many Christians believe in an old earth and believe in the millions of years that presumably, supposedly, led up to Adam and Eve's existence. But the Bible doesn't teach that.
Yeah.
The Bible teaches that Jesus said in Mark 10:6, have you not read, at the beginning of creation, I made them male and female, referring to Adam and Eve, not billions of years after the beginning. It's very important because of this whole history of death.
Yes.
When you look at the fossil record, what do you see? You see fossils, and fossils are evidence of death, right? That's what they are. They're preserved remains of once living organisms. And these common views that are even embraced by Christians are saying that these fossil-bearing rock layers predated Adam, or millions of years predated Adam. But then we're saying, wait, so death and suffering and disease and carnivory and predation has always been here? No, the Bible doesn't teach that. It teaches there was a very good creation. There was no death until Adam sinned. Then Adam sinned, and now we have a fallen creation. And it's that foundation there that really is foundational to the gospel. Because if you don't have an Adam and Eve, you don't have a literal fall, why do we need Jesus to die a literal death, a physical literal death on the cross? It just detaches our faith from its roots, from its history, and leaves your faith disconnected in a way that is hard for people like me who are former skeptics to deal with.
Sure.
And rightfully so.
Yeah, death came by one man. Yes. Very interesting. And it is surprising to me, Chris, how many Christians I meet who believe in that old earth. And I think it's easily disproven, but they seem to dig their heels in. So there's a lot can be said about that. I want to talk about this chart, this chimpanzee to human chart, because I recall vividly the day I opened my 10th grade science/biology book, and there staring me in the face was this classic ape-to-human evolution graphic, even in a parochial school. And I remember having a thought about that because I already did believe in God in a childlike way, not unto salvation, but I did have a fear and reverence for God early on. You know, I thought, why should I believe this? Why is this not being questioned? Why are they saying this is the truth? Is this new information? And this was the 70s. Now, so I went ahead, Chris, and I read up on the history of this, and it's fascinating. It was created by a young Russian-born graduate of the Yale School of Fine Arts named Rudolf Zallinger. And just after World War II, he had already created a splash because he had made a 110-foot-long mural of, quote, 300 million years of dinosaur evolution, and this was for the Peabody Museum of Natural History. And so this was funny to me, his Tyrannosaurus depiction actually became the inspiration for the 1954 Japanese film Godzilla. That's a freebie this morning, influencing an entire generation very broadly. But fast forward to 1965, and this man creates a linear depiction of this crouching monkey to human called The March of Progress. And it was part of a Time Life book called Early Man. Now, in 60 years' time, Chris, this everyone is so programmed by this that they immediately understand what that graphic represents. Now, if a picture paints 1,000 words, then whether or not it's true strikes me as being instantly irrelevant because no one was questioning it. And I think, Chris, if you're going to indoctrinate an entire generation, and we the baby boomers are the biggest generation in America ever, that is a good way to do it. But because science believed it, it's true. But Chris, science doesn't have any agenda, do they?
I'd like to believe that, the scientists are just looking at the evidence with a neutral filter, if that were possible. But the reality is, when it comes to the past, we weren't there. So inevitably, you have to come up with some type of framework, some type of model from which you interpret the evidence through. And in the secular community, they're not open to looking at the evidence in light of the biblical view of history in Genesis. That's total myth to them. Yeah. And what they've done is they've come up with their own history, and they claim it's supported by the science. But I would argue their narrative really originated before they even found a hominid fossil record. It was, before they had Neanderthal, that was about it. But they had no fossil record to speak of. And they were already promoting this idea of ape-to-man evolution. And so that just shows you they invented their own sacred text, if you will. Yeah. The sacred text came first. The evidence came later. And I believe they're still trying to force fit the data to fit that narrative. Yeah. But I would argue the actual fossil evidence better fits the biblical view of creation. Yeah. It better fits the biblical view of history in Genesis. God created apes and humans on the same day of creation, on day 6. We've always coexisted. And some of those types have gone extinct, like the ape types. And it's those types that they call missing links, like Australopithecus and so forth. So the biblical view is simple. Man and apes have always coexisted. One did not evolve into the other.
We were talking off air beforehand. I was watching a presentation by Living Waters, and I have Oscar Navarro from Living Waters on tomorrow. But he was interviewing someone on a campus, and he was talking about creation. She says, well, how do you know? You weren't there. And he said, do you believe in evolution? And she said, yes. And he didn't say, how do you know you weren't there? But, I mean, the implication was there. And it's funny because I think it was Crash who said while we were chatting, God actually anticipates this in Job. And he says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? In other words, you weren't there. But it's by faith, Chris, right? What we see in Genesis. Because if Genesis isn't correct, then none of the rest of the Bible is. And we are wasting our time here. But that is the foundation of what we believe. And so we appreciate your creation science guys who go spend a lot of your life studying this. So, yes, while we were not there, and God has challenged all of us in that text, we can do an awful lot of homework here. And my question for you actually at this point is, we have a modern world of genetics and DNA. And yet that type of science, that Darwin 170-year-old or so, 175-year-old science, they're stuck in that 19th century. If medicine, Chris, if medicine was stuck in that century, that science, we'd probably all be dead by now, Chris. So I'm just thinking, what about this modern world of DNA genetics? How does this whole evolution science theory get around all that, or maybe pretend it doesn't exist? That really mystifies me.
Yeah, and I agree with what you're saying. There is this idea amongst biologists that, they think that natural selection is like this all-powerful, magic wand. And so if they see a change in species, they just say, well, natural selection did it. And the problem is that what we're arguing about is not just small changes in animals that are observable. That's called adaptation. Okay. And the biblical model allows for that. In fact, it actually clearly states that animals bring forth after their kind. And there's this implicit idea that means they're not fixed. They can change. In a fallen creation, God in his wisdom created animals with built-in genetic diversity. So they have the ability, front-loaded in their genome, to adapt to a variety of different environments to produce beautiful variants. And that's important because in a fallen creation, you have to be able to adapt. If God did not create us with built-in diversity, species would go extinct almost immediately. And the genetics term for that is heterozygosity. Think of it as, again, built-in diversity, pre-programmed diversity. And so we're, as mammals, if biologists would call us mammals, we're diploids, which means we have two sets of chromosomes. So we don't have identical chromosomes, they're non-identical. And because they're non-identical, they have variants in them, variant nucleotides or variant DNA letters. And that's really important because when you have that built-in diversity, through reshuffling those chromosomes through sexual reproduction, you can produce variety. So the biblical view is pretty straightforward. Animals bring forth after their kind. There are limits to the extent of change. You can adapt, but that's very different from the, say, ape to man evolution, like that march of progress. In that view, they're claiming that you can change a proto-ape, something that they believe was more like an ordinary ape, and they think that that creature could evolve over millions of years into modern Homo sapiens. The difference there is that requires new information, new DNA sequences that weren't previously there. And so that's different from adaptation, because adaptation is based on already existing information. It's being sorted, selected. You can have mutations that can create variation, but mutations are overwhelmingly harmful. Even beneficial mutations, it turns out, are due to loss of function or loss of regulation. And I could give examples of that. So what I'm trying to say, though, is that there's a big difference between adaptation based on pre-existing information and macroevolution, like ape to man, which requires new information. One is observed, one is science, and the other only exists in books like Early Man, and it's purely artist rendition, showing a series of transitions evolving does not make it science. You have to explain the mechanism behind that, and there's no underlying genetic mechanism to explain how you can go from one type of ape to a totally new kind, all the way into humans. Again, mutations and natural selection cannot create novel sets of DNA information. It can only tweak existing information, and ultimately it's informationally downhill. And I give a whole talk on all the different types of popular examples of beneficial mutations, antibiotic resistance, you name it. They're all breaking systems, loss of regulation, loss of function. And so the mechanism that I'm describing really fits with the biblical view. We live in a fallen creation. Mutations started to arise since Adam sinned, and we're seeing the effect on God's creation as we live.
Yeah, we really are. Sometimes I think, what did the creation originally look like? Do you ever think that way? Because we know all creation groans, and we groan within ourselves as well. And it seems to me as though things are degrading. I don't know, generations and generations of sin and decay, and the promise of a new heavens and a new earth, which is going to be necessary, obviously. But have you ever thought about that, that it just seems like even as humans, after so many generations of disease, we're getting more disease? Does that have any value to it? What do you think?
Yeah. And there's a book behind me, I don't know if you can see, but it's called Genetic Entropy. And I worked with that geneticist, Dr. John Sanford, for 7 years. And he authored the book called Genetic Entropy. We're updating it now. But Genetic Entropy is a very powerful book because it addresses this mutation selection process. Evolutionists claim that you can have these random copying errors called mutations, and that if they're filtered through natural selection, this reproductive filter, to remove the bad mutations and amplify the good ones, they think given enough time, those small changes in what they call microevolution, I think it's just called adaptation though, will eventually lead up to macroevolution. What we're finding though in this book and in his research, when you look at the evolutionary scientific literature amongst those who are called population geneticists, they're acknowledging a very severe problem. And they call it the mutational load paradox in their own scientific literature. The mutational load paradox. What is that paradox? Well, the truth is that although we know that there are harmful mutations, and the ones that are manifested, we can see that they're causing diseases, and they're very sad. I believe it's a result of Adam's sin, the fall. But there's another class of mutation that is far more prevalent, and that's called slightly harmful mutations. In the literature, they call it slightly deleterious or nearly neutral. And those are the most devastating kind because they can't be removed from the population by natural selection. Why can't they be removed? Think about it. Because they're so subtle. They scramble each of your letters of your genome, whether individually or a group of them, depending on what kind of type of mutation it is, but they're scrambling or eroding the genetic information in our genomes. but the damage is not severe. And so because it's not severe, it doesn't manifest outwardly in what's called your phenotype. So natural selection, so to speak, can't remove it from the population. And that's dangerous because they accumulate every generation.
Oh.
So the thought is this: about 100 new mutations enter the human population every generation. I'm sorry. If you have children, let's say of mom and dad, 50 mutations come from mom, 50 mutations come from dad. So that your children, if you have a child, they have 100 more mutations than you. Oh. And if that child gets married and has children, they pass on 100 more mutations to their children. So think about it. Every generation, we're getting more and more mutant. And the vast majority of those are nearly neutral or slightly harmful. And natural selection is not removing them from the human population. So quite literally, we're not evolving, but devolving through the slow accumulation of mutations, and it's systematic. Now, in a biblical timescale, that's not a problem. We had a perfect genome in Adam. He lived, we believe, around 6,000 years ago, and we have good evidence for this. We can talk about radioisotope dating and the challenges to that if you'd like. But the bottom line is that in the biblical model, we don't have a problem with that. But the evolutionist does, because they have millions of years of our ancestry going back to so-called proto-apes. And so in that timeline, and this is why famous evolutionary geneticist Alexei Kondrashov wrote a journal, this famous paper in 1995, and he titled it, "Why Have We Not Died 100 Times Over? The Contamination of Our Genome Through Slightly Deleterious Mutations." So in that time span, we should have mutated our genomes to an oblivion. We should have gone extinct.
Sure.
But instead, they believe we somehow evolved and became Homo sapiens.
Oh, wow. Wow. Very, very interesting. And the effect, in you and I both know the effect of sin on the human race. It's just judgment, we'll become judgment ready once again, just as we did during Noah's day. So, wow, that's a very interesting perspective. And I'm grateful that you explained that. I want to talk about those contested bones because the theory of evolution has huge problems when it comes to bones. And the theory seems to be evolving. I think you even alluded to that already. Because you talk about each new story in this field, when they come up with something new, it seems to invalidate the previous discoveries. How would anyone trust it? Because they're still trying to figure this out. But talk to us about this. It's a theory, but it claims historical origins of humans. I mean, historical science, right. Observable versus historical. I think we touched on that a little bit. But if I'm an average student or even an adult, I'm told to accept it year upon year and piece by piece. In 1950, they thought the universe was 2 billion years old. In 1970, it's up to 6 billion years old. It just gets stranger and stranger. But they're not going to stop, no matter how, my point, Chris, is no matter how ridiculous it gets, they're not going to stop championing this. Talk about being stubborn. Let's talk about those bones. Layers of bones that prove these intermediate species. Where's that at?
Yeah, and you mentioned, they're constantly having new findings, and then it's kind of undermining what they previously claimed. And it is true. You see these headlines. Oftentimes they're, promoting, over promoting, but they have these headlines like a new fossil rewrites human history, rewrites the human tree. Yeah. Very frequently you see rewriting textbooks, rewriting the tree. And what they're really trying to do is get attention, get people to read their articles. Okay. But the truth is, though, is that whenever they have a new finding, it's claimed to upset that tree and kind of question things about, well, who's the correct ancestor? Is Lucy our ancestor? Is there something else as our ancestor? So it just creates more confusion and more of a mess. And actually, I can find quotes, and we have quotes in our book stating that all new discoveries make things more confusing. Quotes almost verbatim, just like that. The truth is, though, is their models are actually not falsifiable. It's kind of a problem. They claim that, if they find a new fossil, they can always rework the interpretation of the data. They can always rework their scenarios to make the data fit. And I would argue that's evidence that it's not falsifiable. Falsifiable means having the potential of being invalidated. But if you can always just change the model to better adjust to fit the data, well, how do you falsify it? It's like nailing jelly to the wall.
Wow.
That's not how scientific theories work. But there is one criteria that I have recognized that you can apply to the fossil record, which is falsifiable. And that would be if you find true human bones predating the human genus.
Okay.
Think about that. What if you find true human bones in the fossil record? Let's assume, for the sake of argument, they're dating methods. Let's assume the dates are right. And if you find true human bones that look just like Homo sapiens, just like true humans, but they're older than the human genus, so that's before we were supposed to have evolved,
Ooh.
how would that be possible? That would be like saying you're born before your grandparents.
Yeah.
Obviously, you can't do that. That's impossible. So in Contested Bones in Chapter 7, we talk about all these several, really numerous bones from what's called the Hadar Formation in Ethiopia. That was where Lucy was found. And we go through numerous bones showing these are anatomically modern. And they even describe it in their own journals as anatomically modern. But they won't call it human. Why? Because according to their framework, humans did not yet exist, did not yet evolve. So they have to call it something else. They'll call it Australopithecus, which is the presumed precursor to humans. And then they can claim, see, these precursors walked upright, just like humans. But that's because they're looking at true human bones that have bipedal locomotor morphologies.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the reason why they look like human knees is because they are. It is a human knee joint. Wow. And so that's a criteria that I would say they can use if they wish, but they're not using it. And so to work around that, they just keep pushing the human genus back older and older. So again, it's like nailing jelly to the wall.
Yeah.
That's what's happening, though, in paleoanthropology today.
How interesting. Transitional fossils. And when you would talk about a new headline, say a research paper or whatever comes out, we've discovered this, we've discovered that. I think the whole idea is to get people to go, yay, now they're going to further prove what I already believe, which is basically a religion. I mean, we can't deny that theory of evolution is a religion, but it's meant to get people excited about it, isn't it? And to continue to perpetuate the hoax.
It is. It just reinforces the prevailing worldview in education systems. And sadly, among many in our generation, even many Christians are embracing theistic evolution. And even the older theories that don't embrace the evolution, they still believe in the geologic timescale, which means you're putting so-called ape men before Adam and Eve. So it's all catering to that prevailing worldview based on the geologic timescale being representing deep time in millions of years. So sadly, even Christians, by and large, are embracing older theories. Therefore, they're okay with ape men before Adam, because that's, well, some aren't aware of the implications.
Sure, right.
That's true as well.
Right.
So that's a good thing, because once they do learn, wait, I'm not comfortable with ape men predating Adam and Eve, then they quickly shift and say, okay, I'm just going to go with the traditional biblical view. Yeah. But a lot of these seminaries, a lot of these Christian institutions, Christian universities, they are embracing old earth creation theories, which place ape men before Adam and Eve. And by ape men, I mean things like Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus sediba, you name it.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. Talking to Chris Rupe this morning. Back to Genesis.org. That's back to the number 2, Genesis.org. Great website, a lot of content there. The book is Contested Bones, and we're going to talk about more when we come back from our break. But how, and this, I'm just going to throw this out, and we can answer this even when we come back. How long do these believers or anybody think that it took to make that chimpanzee into a human? That really fascinates me. In fact, we are going to take a break here, Chris, and I'm going to ask you that when we come back, because how in the world can anyone place a time frame on that beyond the obvious, well, you weren't there because nobody was there. But that, I don't know. I just think that is borders on the absurd. But we are going to talk to Chris about that and see if he agrees with it. So Chris Rupe, back to Genesis.org. Contested Bones is the book. And we want to talk about the missing link, Lucy, when we come back as well. These are all things that were part of my generation of learning. So we'll be back in 2 with more with Dr. Chris Rupe. Stay with us.
The following program is a presentation of Lakeshore Communications Inc. and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of Lakeshore Communications Inc., its sponsors, or donors.
Feedback, questions, and topic suggestions are always appreciated. Email us at comments@standupforthetruth.com.
Welcome back to Stand Up for the Truth, and it is Thursday, November the 13th, and we're talking to Chris Rupe, back to Genesis. I want to ask you real quickly, Chris, on the website, when you open up that page, it mentions a film called Dismantled a scientific deconstruction of the theory of evolution. Talk to us about that. Is that something that you did? Did you do it with someone, or who is responsible for this film, and where can people see it?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So the film was it came out in 2020, and our nonprofit, Back to Genesis, raised the funds totally through the church, through donor support.
Great.
So grateful for all those donors. And this film is talking about some of the things I mentioned here. What about the ape men? What about adaptation? And can those small changes lead up to big changes called macroevolution? So we get into the mutation selection process. We get into so-called beneficial mutations that are resulting in loss of function, loss of regulation. And we really transition from there into the ape men, as I mentioned, and eventually we get to Adam and Eve. And we talk about the remarkable evidence from genome sequencing going back to just two people. And this is not from creationists. This is from the conventional scientific literature. Even from the 80s, they've been claiming that all humans go back to a single mother of the whole human race, and they nicknamed her mitochondrial Eve. Same thing with looking at Y chromosomes, the male sex chromosomes. We all go back to a single male ancestor, and they nicknamed him Y chromosome Adam. So, of course, these are evolutionists. They don't really believe in Adam and Eve of the Bible. Right. They're kind of just doing this tongue-in-cheek, kind of almost making fun of the Christian view. But they're acknowledging tacitly that, look, this is consistent with a superficial reading of Genesis, two people, all humans going back to just two people. Yeah. But, of course, they say, but there was a larger population of other so-called hominids from which they emerged from. Oh. But if you look closely, those larger tribe sizes that they supposedly came from, all those other Y chromosome lineages or mitochondrial lineages, they all went extinct, leaving coincidentally a single lineage back to Eve and a single lineage back to Adam. So the data, taken at face value, is consistent with Adam and Eve. And we talk about how they get the dates based on mutation rates. And you got to watch it. So scene 4, the last 30 minutes, talks all about Adam and Eve, compares the out of Africa model to the out of Babel model, the out of Middle East model, which is the biblical model. And really, they're helping us. They're demonstrating unwittingly that the biblical view is lining up with modern genetics.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the most exciting areas of research that I've been involved with and I'm learning about to this day.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very fascinating. I'm always fascinated because how many people go through, say, Ancestry.com and you learn about these maybe 1,000 people that got you where you are. But, Chris, at some point, the pyramid has to go a different direction. That fascinates me because in this life, we're looking at early people who settled in America, Europeans who came over, and how we can trace all that. And I find that fascinating. I love that sort of thing. But at some point, it has to narrow back down. It only gets so wide before it goes the other way. That's what I can't wrap my head around, Chris.
Yeah. So it's funny because it's fascinating, really, when you combine the evidence going back to Adam and Eve with the idea of we're becoming more and more mutant every generation, which means in the reverse direction. What does that mean in the reverse direction? Rewind the clock, you're less and less mutant in the past.
Right.
So you all go back to an Adam and Eve, and we're less mutant in the past. You're going back towards a perfect genome, a genome without mutations.
Ooh, okay.
Which is the beginning when God created Adam and Eve with a perfect genome. There was no sin originally. There was no death, no mutations, because mutations are a result of the fall. Yeah. They are copying errors, essentially copying errors in the DNA.
Yeah. Oh, that's the key to it. You'd hit the nail on the head. That's the key to it. So if the theory isn't going anywhere, the how still continues on. So that's kind of interesting. Textbooks and media, they present no opportunity to dissect really what is this theory, what it is. They don't care about that. They want to just go forward and tell you the how of it all. And let's get back to these transitional fossils. Yep. If we were to find them, because fossils have been found since the flood, and obviously we believe in a real flood. We believe that only 8 people were saved and they repopulated the earth. What about these fossils? Because how much of that would have been washed away in the flood? I don't know. Tell us about what you think about that.
Yeah, so we do see evidence of erosion for sure. And we also, the most obvious thing, though, that we should point out first is that there are blanket layers, if you will. They're called sedimentary rocks. Okay. These are the blanket layers that are on the continents. And they consist of mudstone, sandstone, limestone. I did my dissertation on limestone. And those are the water-deposited sediments that would have been laid down by the flood. And in those rock layers, they find fossils of sea creatures, of land creatures buried together,
Okay.
thousands of feet above sea level, in places where they can't even invoke uplift. And so we're seeing evidence of a global flood based on these rock layers that are spanning the continents well above sea level. So what mechanism can explain that? Well, a global flood can.
Yeah.
And so as a sedimentary geologist, that is the evidence for the flood. It's the sedimentary rocks. And then after the flood, and by the way, the flood was not just 40 days and 40 nights. If you read the Bible, it's very clear that there's a prevailing stage that lasted 150 days where the waters were progressively prevailing or increasing on the continents. And then you had the receding phase for the remainder of the year. And during the receding phase of the waters getting washed off the continents, that's when you'd have mass amounts of sheet erosion, followed by channelized erosion, forming canyons and things like that. And so we do have a mechanism of not only forming the layers, because we have a global flood prevailing stage, sea level rising, depositing sediments on the continents, burying animals, forming fossils, and then the erosional phase forming the topography we see today largely. And of course, there's been rain and storms since then, of course, to further do its work.
Very interesting that is. I want to get back to I want to talk about Lucy, the missing link. That's what I was told in high school, that's what she was. Human skulls, they talk about cavemen, Neanderthals, different skull sizes, and they do vary over generations and amongst ethnic groups, I would say. But what about the skull sizes, and what about the size of Lucy? I'm just going to let you kind of run with this because I think when we talk about when I was a kid, or we see movies about cavemen and they'd grunt, they didn't have language, and it's all just so absurd. The older I get in the Lord, the more absurd a lot of that looks to me. And movies like Planet of the Apes, it's just ridiculous. Anyway, getting back to my question, let's talk about the size of human skulls, the shape of skulls, the sloping foreheads, etc. And Lucy, talk to us about Lucy.
Yeah, we'll get to Lucy. And about skull size, it's a great question because for years I've been saying Neanderthals are kind of brutish cavemen, and there are some very older artist renditions showed them as bent-kneed, bent-hipped, bent in a bent-over position that is no longer accepted today by any evolutionary scientist. We now know their skeleton is fully human, so that's why they call them Homo neanderthalensis, not ape, which would be Australopithecus. They're Homo, human.
Yes.
And they've now sequenced the genomes of 13 different Neanderthal individuals. So they have DNA preserved in their bones, which fits with the biblical view that they're recent, by the way. DNA is a very fragile molecule. It doesn't last that long. But we do have these genomes sequenced. And it turns out Neanderthals were fully human. And in fact, many of us here have bits and pieces of Neanderthal DNA in us because our ancestors interbred with them, which is the very definition of a species. One of the most popular definitions is the biological species concept, which means if you can interbreed and produce fertile offspring, you are the same species. And that's why even evolutionists like Savant Pabo, who spearheaded the genome sequencing project for Neanderthals, says we've essentially shown they're the same species, Homo sapiens. So there is a difference of opinion now. Some think we should maintain them as a separate species. Others argue Neanderthals are essentially us. And that is very biblical because both are where we find them in the fossil record. They're not in the flood sediments. Neanderthals are in cave systems that have, for example, that have eroded into the flood sediments or just post-flood sediments. So we know as creation geologists very clearly these are not flood deposits. These are post-flood, and therefore they're post-flood, post-Babel, I would say, descendants of Adam and Eve.
Interesting, because when you say Neanderthal, like I said, as a kid of the 70s, that is a caveman. That is a completely different person. It's hard to get that out of our heads. What does that word actually mean, Neanderthal? Why are they given a specific name? Is it because of evolutionists claiming that they are a transitional species? Is that why they even have a name?
Yeah, and today they don't believe it's transitional anymore.
Right. Okay.
The term missing link's a misnomer, really, but the idea is that they're some other human species, and that does come from these ideas of evolution. But we find other humans with, I've even seen modern people with heavy brow ridges, and there are other humans that are alive today that have non-projecting chins. So those are the features that they think are so-called. They claim they're primitive.
Right.
Meaning more ape-like. But actually, humans today have those features.
Yeah.
So it's not a really good basis for claiming it's a separate species.
Okay.
In fact, their brain size is larger than average humans today. And so that's
Boy,
another.
could I make a comment on the size of people's brains today? Because without sounding too cynical, people seem to have lost the ability to think through the simplest things. So that's my little sarcastic remark for the morning. But anyway, as you were, the human skulls and the different ethnic groups and like you said, it's a closed system, right? There's no new information, so they should never have gone there in the first place. So the missing link, Lucy. Talk to us about that, because humans have come in all shapes and sizes through all generations. So talk to us about Lucy.
Yes. So on one hand, we have Neanderthals, large-brained, clearly human skeletons, some unique features in the skull, very robust-looking people. And so what's interesting, though, is that years ago, they would say that brain size can be used to indicate whether you're more primitive or not. So if you have a smaller brain size, you must be more like an ape. The problem is what's most important is not brain size, as you kind of hinted at. it's neural organization.
Okay.
It's the organization of your brain. And so what we have here is a false view of evolution that has now been completely revised. We find small-bodied humans, for example, in the island of Flores, and they like to make them out to be a new species of human. They call them Homo floresiensis. But the cranial capacity, or the brain size, is the size of a chimpanzee, around 420 cubic centimeters. And so even humans can have, even very intelligent humans have had brain sizes, even in modern times, around 625, overlapping with, say, gorilla. So this idea of small brains mean primitive is simply not true. And so that's an important thing to understand, because that was one of the major reasons why they're claiming separate species status for some of these smaller brained fossils that we find. And I think Lucy is among them. So we can get into Lucy if you'd like.
Yeah, go ahead. It's funny, while you were talking, I was thinking of people talked about people who can't think, or bird brains, right? But a bird, I watch bird videos, and I'm telling you, their capacity to mimic and speak, and that they're trainable. They almost seem to reason. They seem to have moods and that sort of thing. So you're right. When I think of birds, I think there's no such thing as a bird brain. So that's my 2 cents on that. Let's talk about Lucy. We got some time left, and I'd love to hear more about the research on that.
Yeah. So my perspective on Lucy is not typical amongst other creationists. So let our listeners be aware.
Okay.
I do have a different view that's not as popular amongst creationists, although it is gaining a lot of momentum from several of my creation friends in different ministries are right on board. But the claim for years from creationists have been that Lucy is a chimp-like creature, or a gorilla-like creature that walked on all fours. And the evolutionists, on the other hand, have been saying, no, Lucy could walk bipedally, upright, like modern humans. And so from the neck down in museums, you'll see Lucy looking very human. Human feet, human hands. But the skull in museums is shown looking very ape-like. And so you have to ask the question, well, why are they showing the skull of Lucy looking ape-like? Is that based on the fossil evidence? Well, it turns out the few broken bones of Lucy's skull are insufficient to estimate the cranial capacity, or brain size, and insufficient to even reconstruct the shape of the skull. So how do they do it? They use other fossils, which I believe are true apes, from a totally separate stratigraphic layer, a totally different fossil catalog number, different locality, and they use those more complete skulls, which I think are the true ape, Australopithecus, and they use that as a model to reconstruct Lucy's skull. And there's actually even evolutionists who have written in scientific journals why Lucy's skull was not done correctly and should be considered Homo, human. Same with the jaw. So these are evolutionists arguing that, and I could cite a paper for you for that. But so for years, I used to believe that Lucy was an ape. I accepted the typical creation perspective that Lucy was an ape. And I didn't have any reason to doubt it until I dug in deep. And I looked at the hip. And if you look at the hip, now if you look at textbooks, they'll admit this all across the board. One of the most distinguishing features of the human skeleton is the hip. So if you look at a chimpanzee hip, it's very tall. And in side view, it's very thin. And the sacrum, which holds the two blades together in the middle, that it's called a sacrum. It's very long and narrow. Very different from humans. Humans, the hip is broad, bowl-shaped. It's shorter. And the sacrum is also wider and shorter. And that bowl-shaped pelvis of humans is so visually distinct that I would say a fifth grader could easily tell apart a human from an ape hip. It's that intuitive. And so when you look at Lucy's hip, the hip of Lucy is unmistakably human.
Wow.
So if the hip is human, why have we been claiming that it's ape? Well, I think it's because creationists have been misled by the claim that it's Australopithecus. But again, they call it Australopithecus because they can't call it human. It predates the human genus. So of course they're not going to call it human. But if you find human morphological features, a human hip, human knee, human ankle, other features that are human, as a creationist, we have no problem calling those human if they look human.
Yeah.
Because the biblical model does teach coexistence. But so even though it's compatible with our model, it's incompatible with theirs. So my argument is that Lucy is not an ape. It's a small-bodied human, a pygmy, and many of Lucy's features are almost identical to a pygmy from the island of Flores. And they nicknamed that species Homo floresiensis, but members of the discovery team simply called it Homo sapien, a human, and I agree.
Wow.
So all creationists agree it's human from the Indonesian island of Flores, and it has same limb proportions, same size, same cranial capacity, same flaring hips. So I'm arguing Lucy is not a missing link. It's fully human. And because it predates the origin of the human genus, assuming for the sake of argument their dates, it falsifies the ape-to-man story.
Interesting. Now, so I guess I come to the conclusion then that there was more than one Lucy, that this isn't a singular creature. I use that word very loosely. There were more Lucys out there. Do they conclude that as well?
So in the perspective that I'm sharing, I think that Lucy's skeleton, the partial skeleton that was found in 1974 by Don Johansen, is a human pygmy, a small-bodied human. And they actually found a knee joint the year before from the same Hadar formation, the same geologic formation. And that knee joint was called specimen AL-129-1. AL means Afar locality. That's where they found it, in the Afar region. And that knee joint is small, but it has fused growth plates, confirming it was an adult. Okay. Yet in morphology, in every respect, is identical to a modern human knee. So not only is Lucy small-bodied human, we have a second example, undisputed morphologically human knee joint, also from the same formation. So even today, there are 1 million pygmies living in the central region of Africa. And I believe during the post-flood period, during the era of when East Africa was more humid, had lots of lakes, it was more lush, I believe there was a population, probably many populations of small-bodied humans living there.
Wow. Very interesting. Yeah. And you have an article on this if the listener wants more information or want to maybe wrap their heads around it a little bit better. Lucy and the Pygmy Human Hypothesis, and this is on backtogenesis.org. Very, very interesting. I'm still fascinated by those transitional fossils because I can't imagine what that would look like. Or has anyone, here's a question for you, has anyone attempted to take fossils that they chose to join together in a certain way to prove this transitional phase between chimps and humans? Has that been done? Because you'd think, everything's up for grabs as far as I'm concerned with evolution.
Yes, and it has been done before on purpose, which, my secular colleagues who oppose my view would probably be annoyed that I bring up Piltdown Man, because they say, oh, you creationists, you always bring up Piltdown Man. But it was based on a human skull fit together with an orangutan jaw, and the teeth were filed down to kind of hide the fact that it was so robust like an ape. But the idea there is that it was a deliberate fraud. And in most cases, virtually all cases, I don't believe are fraud amongst evolutionists. It's just they sincerely believe the paradigm. They sincerely believe the ape-to-man story. And that does lend way to accidentally mixing ape and human fossils because, for example, in one of our chapters in our book, we talk about Homo habilis. And it was found by Lewis and Mary Leakey, and they were working in Olduvai Gorge, Tanzania in the 60s. And what they found was evidence of a human foot, for example, and other features that looked more what they would call more primitive. And for years, they've claimed for years, they've passed away now, that it's a true species, a sound species. But their own son, Richard Leakey, disagrees. And he can't decide which 50% belongs to Homo or human and which 50% belongs to Australopithecus. And so there's this debate for years about, is Homo habilis a sound species, or is it a phantom taxon, they say, a make-believe or pretend species, their language, not mine. So they do have a tendency to accidentally commingle true human bones with ape bones. Why? Because they're oftentimes fragmentary, they're isolated, and they're found in what they call hominid butchery sites. There's evidence that these humans, which I believe are true humans, nomadic hunter-gatherer people groups, I believe, again, this is post-flood, that they were actually butchering apes, and evolutionists believe the same thing. Louis Leakey mentioned that. He said it looks like they were actually butchering the animals, defleshing carcasses, and consuming them. And so they are found in the same bone beds. They're found together. So imagine if you're an evolutionist, you're coming there with a framework of a missing link creature in your head, something that could walk upright but has a smaller brain. You're going to have a predisposition to put the bones together in a way that you think is transitional. And it's not because of fraud, but that's because that's what their narrative would predict.
Sure. That makes sense. I remember going to the Museum of Natural History in D.C. as a child and seeing these massive dinosaur bones and all of everything that had been put together. It is stunning to look at, especially if you're a child and you go, wow, what in the world? But dinosaurs coexisted with humans, and that's an argument too that has been out there for a very long time. Dinosaurs, did they predate humans? Were they at a different site? What is the proper interpretation of that, Chris?
Yeah, and this again is where the evolutionists or my secular colleagues would say you're insane. You sound like one of those crazy flat earthers. No, I don't believe in flat earther.
No,
I do have a real PhD. It's not a fake one. I'm a real scientist. But I disagree with that interpretation. It's based on radioisotope dating methods. I give whole talks just on those assumptions. There are underlying assumptions that a lot of people aren't aware of. So it's not just a simple matter of just following the data. The data is interpreted. Those isotope concentrations are interpreted, and they're interpreted based on assumptions about past conditions. So I reject the dating methods for scientific reasons as well as biblical reasons. Yeah. And what I'd like people to know is that there is evidence from a new field of science called molecular paleontology, which shows dinosaurs have original tissue still in their bones. Now, for years, they've been saying this is impossible. The laws of physics and chemistry show they should be completely degraded, and they fought this for a decade. But now it's settled science. They find numerous examples. They have 60 separate peer-reviewed journals now confirming soft tissue preserved in dinosaurs that are supposedly older than 65 million years old. Red blood cells, which are made of mostly water, flexible, stretchy tissues that snap back to the original shape.
Wow.
And this baffled them for years. They tried to say, well, maybe it's, these things are contamination. All those arguments have gone away because the data still bears out its original soft tissue. And their own degradation studies, their own degradation models show things like collagen, a very common structural protein they find in dinosaurs, should not last even over 1 million years. Yet we find it in dinosaurs that are supposedly 80 million years old and older.
Wow.
And they're now finding DNA in dinosaurs and identifying them through even separate independent chemical tests confirming DNA in bone-building cells that are still preserved in dinosaurs, and they're in a structure that looks like a nucleus. So this is not contamination.
Yeah.
It really belongs to the dinosaur, and DNA is one of the most fragile biomolecules that we have, that we know of. And so how can they stay there for millions of years? Even their own literature, again, their DNA half-life studies show DNA does not last that long. So as biblical creationists, I say, well, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Dinosaurs lived recently. Many were fossilized during the flood.
Sure.
They were buried during the flood. And we would say the biblical view teaches they were created by God on day 6, and that's also when God made Adam and Eve. Mm-hmm. And so they did come on the ark. They could fit. I mean, these are all questions creationists answer all the time.
Yeah.
They came off the ark. I believe those that came off the ark did spread throughout the earth. And we do have dragon legends, I think, are great embellishments. Mm-hmm. Some are not even dinosaurs. They're serpents. They're other creatures. Sure. But there's a common element to these that suggests they were real creatures. They were actual dinosaurs. And so that's the biblical model.
Wow. Very, very interesting. And knowledge is increasing, right, Chris, because we have genetics and DNA and all kinds of things that we can observe now that put a lot of these theories to shame. Chris, we are out of time. Dr. Chris Rupe, back to Genesis.org. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. I learned stuff. And to me, that's what it's all about. And I trust the audience did too. Always a great topic of conversation. It builds up our faith, right? So thank you, Chris.
Amen.
I hope we can do it sometime again.
I would love to. I really enjoyed
Right.
this and pray this was encouraging to the audience.
Great. Sounds good. All right. Tomorrow from Living Waters, Oscar Navarro, and he is the host of the Way of the Master TV program, and we have so much to talk to him about. I'm looking forward to that. And then, of course, next week, a whole new week of fresh podcasts. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. We need to know that. 1 Corinthians 15:58. God bless. Have a wonderful day. See you tomorrow.